This is on now. Is that all right? So, thanks for coming. It would have been a very intimate audience indeed if you hadn't made it this afternoon. Anyway, as long as I'm not talking to myself, I'm perfectly happy. So, this is the last talk in a series of 6, and I said last week that I'd be reviewing really the content of the previous 5 lectures, which might explain the absence of a number of very loyal members of audience who've been to all the previous ones. But it isn't intended to be repetitive. However, for those of you to whom it's a completely new series, it'll be maybe interesting, more interesting than a fragment. However, for those of you that haven't been to the previous ones, I'm not intending to give very sort of comprehensive accounts of some of the paintings we're going to look at, because there isn't time to do that in an hour, and it's something that I've elaborated quite a lot in the last 5 weeks. So, nevertheless, as I began the series, I explained that I'm an artist and not an art historian, and that the impulse to do this series was to examine my own responses to a small number of paintings. And so there isn't a conclusion to be drawn this afternoon either. But at least for my own interest, there's something that struck me, purely sort of in terms of my own experience. It's quite a long time ago that I sat down and wrote a list of paintings or painters who I would like to talk about looking at. And it didn't strike me until a week ago that 4 out of the 5 lectures in this series were based on works that first came to my attention in the same year, which was 1972, when I was a second-year painting student. So you can see you're working that out. I'm 54 in June, so I left art school quite a long time ago, in 1973, 31 years ago. Is that right? No, more than that. Anyway, I did announce that a Henry Raeburn painting that we'll be looking at arrived in the form of a postcard through my letterbox in that year. And I brought the postcard with me just to prove it. What I hadn't realized is, until I took a little second-hand book on Piero della Francescas off my bookshelf just over a week ago, and happened to notice in the front cover it said David Ward 1972, and I remembered taking it off the shelf of a second-hand bookshop in Winchester, where I was a student. That was the first year, apart from cursory mentions in very sort of preliminary art history introductions at school, that I opened this little book, and something about these tiny reproductions made me spend 15p. And in the same year, I got to know the work of the painter, the late Patrick Heron, in depth. And in the same year, I wrote a short essay for a presentation at art school on the Vermeer paintings in the National Gallery in London. So 4 of the 5 things that I've been talking about and we're going to look at today came to my attention over 30 years ago, and they've remained very important to me. I think that's, for me at least, that's quite interesting, because I could make a list as long as all of your arms put together of artists and paintings that impress me intensely. And yet, when I whittled it down, it turns out that I must have been doing something that I was supposed to be doing as a second-year painting student, looking at things a lot, and I must have just been very receptive for things to strike me so forcibly that I really still want to talk about them all this time later. In the past few weeks, we've looked at Piero della Francescas, and we looked, amongst other things, at this fresco in Montechi called the Madonna del Parto, which means the Madonna of Childbirth, or the pregnant Madonna. And we talked about the shallow space in which the figures are depicted. The angels are holding back the fabric, quite important, fabric of a tented enclosure. There's a missing piece of this which explains that it's a tent. It's a kind of tent. But you can see the figures are framed by the fabric, and they're contained spatially by it. So it's a very, very shallow space. You could almost imagine that you might not be able to step more than one pace backwards in that space between what's on the surface of the picture plane and the rear sort of plane that's parallel, roughly, slightly curved to that. We noted that one of the extraordinary physical qualities of fresco is that the pigment and its binding agents are painted onto damp plaster, and that the process of adhesion is through that damp plaster absorbing some of the pigment and binding agent into the fabric of the surface of the wall, which is a completely different sort of materiality to an easel painting. And in those two summaries, the question of fabric, the question or the observation of fabric and the observation of the shallow picture plane, the importance of an identification between the surface of the painting and the surface of something else which is very shallow in the painting, is something that we'll return to in the next 45 minutes. And the question of the materiality of painting is something that I've laboured quite a lot and that I'll return to over and over again. I realise, because I'm not attempting a comprehensive series of talks about looking at painting, that I have chosen not only things that are linked sort of autobiographically for me, but also paintings that share a particular sort of composure. And this question of composure or stillness in the painting is something which I've adopted a term of the contemplative mode. I think I'm talking about different works of painting that fall somehow within a contemplative mode of looking. And we'll try and make a little bit more sense of that as we go along. Last week's talk was dedicated entirely to looking at Vermeer, and this is one of the two Vermeer paintings that hang in the National Gallery in London. It's of interest in comparison to the work that we've just looked at, in that it contains the representation of a female figure and also the representation of a winged creature. But this is no angel exactly. It's Cupid, or rather Cupid in the guise of Eros, on the seashore, often depicted as being attendant to the birth of Aphrodite from the sea. But similarly, as Ivan Gaskell, in his marvelous book, which is an entire book dedicated to the study of this single painting, the depth of this space is practically measurable. You know, we know the size of a typical Netherlandish blue tile, so-called Delft tile, and it's calibrated like a ruler running horizontally and diagonally towards the front of the picture. We can, although we can't precisely locate the figure or even the furniture on the grid of the floor, we can actually estimate roughly the depth of the painting. And so it's another painting with a very definite bounded space. It's a shallow space. And it's notable for Vermeer's use throughout his life of the presence of paintings within paintings. And there is an additional painting I suggest between the two landscapes, the Cupid or Eros painting. There is another painting which is in the form of this surface, which is a representation of artificial marbling applied to the wooden cabinet of the virginal keyboard instrument called the virginals. If you go to the National Gallery, as I'm sure you all have, and study these particular Vermeers very, very closely, and if you haven't, I suggest you zoom down there tomorrow. You'll see that here is a rectangle, two subdivided rectangle, that attracted my attention very much as a student because of the way that the paint is applied to the surface of the painting. Here you can say, well, in these paintings within paintings, Vermeer is simplifying, abstracting quite considerably the appearance of other paintings. But when he applies the paint to the surface of the canvas in order to represent artificial marbling on wood, he seems to apply the paint exactly as he would if he was painting the musical instrument itself. It's not a cautious, finicky piece of meticulous representational painting. He applies the paint directly. You can see the brush going on the surface and rolling. You can imagine him twisting the brush handle in his fingertips, rolling the brush around, just as a marbler would if they were decorating a candlestick or a piece of furniture. So he's just applying paint to a surface. It's a very abstract thing, very attractive to me as a young painter involved in non-figurative painting. It's an application of paint of a completely different order to simulating the appearance of a cloudscape, for instance, in another painting within a painting. Oh, I've just jumped. Here we are. This is a Turner Seascape, also in the National Gallery. It's called Morningstar. Even blown up to this enormous scale, it's difficult enough when you're looking at the actual painting to detect the presence of the star in the sky. This, however, is the reflection of the morning star in the shallow water on the beach. So somewhere in a line straight up from that, about a third of the way down from the top of the painting, is a small deposit of paint which represents the star itself. But as I say, it is of interest, I think, that the star itself is dimmer than its reflection. And it's an effect I've actually noticed sometimes, especially in a kind of pale sky. But this, of course, is a phenomenally restrained late Turner. There's a small dog here, which is a delightful little presence, and a figure with a basket and a rod or stick of some kind, either a navigational aid or the mast of a sunken ship. But phenomenally impressive as a sort of reduction. We're very drawn to some of the late and so-called unfinished Turner paintings in the modern age. After Turner's death, the 19th century sensibility that prevailed regarded many canvases as in an unfinished state and therefore of no interest whatsoever to an audience, and many were not exhibited for decades. I mentioned last week that the curator Mark Francis, about 5 years ago, curated a very, very interesting exhibition of Turner paintings at Tate, Liverpool, where the paintings were removed from their frames and exhibited without frames on the wall of the gallery. And Mark's intention really was to draw attention to this sort of rather visceral materiality of Turner's paintings. that as soon as you can see the edges of the canvas sort of taut round, tacks, knocked in flows of paint, they take on a quality that he had a desire to bring an audience, in a sense, closer to the paintings, closer to the feeling that the opportunity that had only ever previously existed in Turner's studio before the paintings were framed. But this takes its place here on two fronts, really. One, as a tiny little line of continuity from the beach and seascape that we see our Cupid Eros standing on, but also because it seems to be a part of a completely different category of painting, a deep landscape in which the tiny present figure is seen against this extensive horizontal plane. And the relationship between this horizontality and within painting and the verticality of the canvas and our relationship to that verticality is something we'll return to. But it also, I think, achieves, especially when you see the painting, a resolute tendency to announce itself as existing on a flat plane. Needless to say, it's often related to certain late Rothko paintings. This is the Reverend Robert Walker skating, who began the entire series, and it was a postcard image, not this particular photograph of this painting that arrived through my letterbox that I mentioned earlier on. And here, I think, there is a coming together in terms of studio practice between something of an important distinction anyway to be drawn. You know, there are countless stories about Turner's physical involvement with with nature, with the outside world. This process of observing, but also painting out of doors, as well as painting in the studio, painting in all weathers, a very extreme sort of practice of plein air painting. Henry Raeburn was of a completely different persuasion. He was a studio painter, and there isn't a chance, really. I think most historians I've read would agree there is no real likelihood that Raeburn went out on a frosty afternoon to observe the Reverend on the ice just outside Edinburgh. But it is a recognizable representation of the Arthur's Seat and related landscape around Duddington Loch outside Edinburgh. However, we can assume pretty definitely that the Reverend, or somebody standing in for him, would have been posed, probably supported on props to keep him in a position long enough for Raeburn to develop the painting. That means he was in a room, not in a landscape. And it strikes me that in a way, rather than there's a lot to be observed in this representation of horizontality. We will look at that a little later on. But I showed this originally next to a photograph of a skater in an identical skating position from a 1920s publication on figure skating, in which the photographer has touched out a wooden prop very badly, so you can see where it was for this figure. And a white sheet goes up as typical, you know, in photographic studio background. And I have an interiorized sort of fantasy of the Reverend Robert Walker similarly posed against a backdrop. So the representation in the end of the landscape is quite abstract. It's quite theatrical. It bears resemblances to the way in which certain flats in theatre design are painted. Now you say, what on earth are you doing in terms of continuity with this? This is a Patrick Heron painting from the 1970s. I'm not exaggerating, I'm drawing a relationship actually that's to do with silhouette and figure-ground relationships between this painting and the Patrick Heron painting. I want to take you closer into the surface of this painting. That's zooming in on that shape in the bottom right-hand corner. And I think you can probably see at this scale. Actually, interestingly enough, I hadn't seen this projected until this afternoon. It's highly probable from memory that at this enlargement, scale of enlargement, that this corner of the painting is pretty near actual size. I should have brought my props with me this afternoon. At an earlier one of these talks, I brought in a little Japanese watercolor brush or ink brush with a bamboo handle. Are you all familiar with these? They're they're quite popular. Heron used these tiny little brushes to apply paint to canvases of enormous scale. If you think of this as pretty much accurately actual size, and then scale up that accordingly, it's a very big painting. And oil paint was applied with these tiny brushes. Here is a detail, very close-up detail from another painting. You can see the little ridges of paint mounding up from these tiny little brush strokes. So these were huge undertakings physically. And once begun, a shape had to be finished because left overnight there would be a sort of tide mark. So if you look in here, you can see tiny little variations of density, and this is because of the spreading of this sort of creamy textured oil paint. Very, very slightly diluted, but if you can imagine the consistency of a kind of thick pouring cream, that kind of texture applied. And this, I think, is something I've tried to draw attention to, is the sort of manufacture of paintings, the physical mode in which they're achieved, and this spreading out. Heron talked about one of his earlier paintings, not about brush strokes or mark making. He talked about the touch. And this was a painting with vertical paint mark, much bigger brush, very big hogshair brush, big strokes. Talked about the vertical touch, not the vertical mark or the vertical brush stroke, but the touch, he said, got longer and longer. The vertical touch became longer and longer. And if you think about that, then it's very different to the notion of, in a sense, of applying paint at all. It's more to do with developing a sort of bodily tactile relationship with this slightly pliant surface of a stretched canvas. You know, the painter in this case touching the canvas with the brush, and then the eye, as it were, seeing, noticing the consequence of the touch, and the consequence of the touch is the appearance of liquid colour. Liquid colour is left behind by the touch. It's a very very different sort of relationship, I suggest, with the canvas as a surface, or the canvas as a kind of analogue to the body. Now this is the last, is a very grainy black and white photograph of the last Henry Raeburn painting, and you can see extraordinary virtuoso stuff here. There's no drawing, there's no conventional blocking in or painting in of areas with tone to build up the composition, which is then refined or elaborated by the progress of painting. This is, if there are a couple of interesting terms here as well on top of plein air painting. The application of paint in the Heron is entirely one surface, it's one coat. There's never, quite literally ever, in that period of his work, a second coat of paint, or even, there's no layering. It's one layer. There's a painting term for this, alla prima painting, and it's sort of consummate alla prima painting. It's everything happens in one layer. It's one layer of painting, and completely different to this kind of painting, where, in a sense, a lot of the paint is mixed on the surface of the canvas. That aspect of oil paint that is often remarked on as being one of its most revolutionary technical qualities when it was invented, which was the fact that its oiliness allowed it to be worked over time. Very, very different to that sucking in of material in the fresco to the surface. And you can see Heron wasn't interested in that notion of reworking over time. It's completely immediate, one surface painting. Very different to this. This is wet into wet painting. This is mixing greasy material into itself on a flat surface, and entirely through this correspondence of observation to the subject, to the seated subject, direct painting. Just imagine that. I mean, it's extremely virtuoso. It's directly to the representation. I need to remind myself, oh yes. You look back at the Vermeer. One of the things that Ivan Gaskell draws a lot of attention to is this object that the Cupid Eros figure is holding up in the air. And he shows, as have other historians, that there were popular prints in the Netherlands at the same time as this painting that represent Cupid holding up a card with a number 1 on it. And under the foot of the little figure, other cards with other numbers, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and usually accompanied by a motto, the popular emblem of the day. And the motto would say the equivalent of, the lover should love only one. Okay. And these other numbers are discarded. Gaskell draws attention to the fact that this card is blank and what this might mean. We're not going to pursue that sort of narrative in the emblems or iconography of the painting, but to take instead a point that Gaskell arrives at eventually, which is that really there are limits to the interpretative potential of painting, beyond which the painting is lost sight of. And he brings us back to the fact that this is simply a blank rectangle, and suggests that we've got several layers of representation in the same picture. We have the framed canvas on the wall of the National Gallery, which depicts an interior space of a definite sort of size, within which the figure of this woman stands. Then within that representation, indeed on the surface of one of the surfaces of the representation, are these other paintings within paintings. One of them is the Cupid, which takes us into the representation of a coastal seascape space. But within that painting is another potential painting, which is this little rectangle, which is a succession of rectangles that we're invited to address within the painting. And I drew attention to a photographic work by the Canadian artist Jeff Wall, And this is one detail. I drew attention, on the one hand, to the apparent state of reverie that the principal figures in it appear to be in. This is a detail from the other side of the photograph. The figures appear to be conservators in relationship to the surface, in relation to the surface of a 360-degree painted panorama that exists in Lucerne. I did a whole lecture about this, both here actually and at Westminster last year. But this is just a detail of it. If we think about what we've been talking about, in this part of the Jeff Wall photograph at least, there are certain relationships to note. We have these two female figures in a defined space in relation to a painted surface. It's not a painting within a painting, it's a painting within a photograph. We know from Jeff Wall's own writings, he's very adept at theorizing his own work. The work is called restoration. That what the restorers appear to be doing is applying conservation tissue to the damaged surface of a 19th century panorama. And we know from Jeff Wall's extensive writings on the paintings of the artist on Kawara that include flat monochrome paintings with the dates of their completion painted onto them, that Wall applies a great store of significance on the appearance of monochrome painting in the early 20th century. And there is a very, very obvious detail that emerges from reading his writing and looking at this work, which is the suggestion that these flat little rectangles are like miniature monochrome paintings being applied to the surface of a 19th century history painting, and setting up a very interesting spatial dialogue, by the way, I think, in the way they appear to float in front of a depicted receding space. And this is a very poor photograph of an early Malevich painting from about 1918, I think, a white-on-white painting of the type that Jeff Wall writes about as a watershed in the development of painting in the 20th century. We'll come back to that. Here's a close-up. You can see more clearly. The thing to remember here is the grotesque enlargement involved in talking about paintings like this. You know, the Vermeer painting in the National Gallery is about that big. Yeah. So this is, heaven knows what Vermeer would, he would probably have loved it actually, I suppose, wouldn't he? Seeing things as big as this. Back we go to Raeburn because we're making a more constructed relationship now. Here is this figure, and behind her she is on the surface of a painted canvas, of course, and behind her now you can see the more clearly the physical surface of the painting. Her head is lodged absolutely there in the corner of the rectangle, of the lower left-hand rectangle of another painting, and the surface of it as a painting is drawn attention to. Just as we were remarking on the presence of Raeburn's skater existing kind of inlaid like a piece of, like a sort of lapidarian shape, practically inlaid into the fabric of the painting. which brings us to some thoughts about this Ingres painting, the Vulcan Sunbather, which is in the Louvre in Paris. Helpful in looking at this and clarifying my thoughts about this painting were some comments by Norman Bryson, who notes an art historical lineage backwards in time. He notes that Ingres was very aware of the scale of his reputation in relation to historical precedents. And the historical figure for Ingres of huge magnitude was Raphael. It's known that that Ingres responded to a famous portrait by Raphael called La Fornina, which is a shoulder portrait of a woman's face turbaned. That one of Ingres' sources for this painting is a kind of 180-degree rotation of the Ingres figure away from the viewer, turning the figure away from the viewer. I noted when I went through Goldsmith's library's extensive slide catalogues of paintings that the Vulcan Sunbather appears, this figure, this configuration of the figure, appears repeatedly in different scenes in Ingres. But nowhere else does it appear in this curtained, shallow space. You can see how shallow the space is. This is a wall. It's not conveyed in a reproduction like this, but this little circle here is a brass or gold lion's head with water pouring out of its mouth into what we assume is a bath down here. There's a little splash of water. Nevertheless, if I had the images, you would be able to see this. In all other scenes, there are deep spaces, usually with many other figures. This is conspicuous because of, not only because of the shallow fabric, and you can see from the painting of the rear plane of the space that it's hung with fabric, but the entire painting draws attention to fabric. In the drape here, very conventional spatial device in the draping of sheets, the winding of a sheet around the arm and the winding of fabric in the turbaned head. All these things drawing our attention to the notion of fabric in an object which is, after all, painted on a piece of fabric, piece of canvas. Now there's an art historical line to be drawn towards the future from Ingres. This is a painting by Gerhard Richter, the contemporary German painter, called Betty. It's a painting based very closely, as all his figurative paintings are, on a photograph, and it's a photograph of his daughter Betty. And we know from Richter's remarks that he was very conscious indeed of the formal relationship between this painting and the Ingres bather that we've just been looking at. But what's Betty looking at? When I first saw this painting, all sorts of things crossed my mind as to the identity of this space that she's looking towards. I even thought maybe it might be an ominously dark sky. But then I discovered, both through looking at it more closely and through reading about it, that, let's wait for that to go by, that this small rectangle tells a great deal. This is the bottom edge of a painting. This is a piece of white wall and distant floor. Gerhard Richter doesn't only make extraordinarily accomplished figurative paintings, he makes various categories of completely abstract paintings. And one of those categories is the grey monochrome canvas. So we I find myself coming back to this monochromacity again. In London at the Gagosian Gallery near King's Cross in Britannia Street, you can see a big 3-panel grey monochrome painting by Gerhard Richter of this type in an exhibition at the moment. So Betty is turning away. You can see she's been orientated towards the viewer, and she has turned to look away from her father and his camera towards a painting of his. And I don't need to labour this point about the shallow pictorial space again. I think it's pretty self-evident by now. In this often seemingly enormous category that we know as the monochrome painting, that has continued and continues even today as an almost ubiquitous form of abstraction since Malevich. A painter who holds my attention uniquely is Ad Reinhardt. And since it was one of Ad Reinhardt's stated ambitions to produce unreproducible paintings, I'm only going to show you this one extremely poor reproduction of one of the canvases. But from 1960, for the next 6 or 7 years before his untimely early death, Reinhardt painted only what he called the black paintings, that were always the same size, that were always divided into a grid of 9 squares, and that were always painted in an attempt to achieve a completely uniform, undifferentiated, beautifully matte surface. And I'll just read you, because it conveys, I think, something both of his rigour and his extraordinary sense of humour. This is a little quote by Ad Reinhardt about the desire to make paintings that revealed no narrative or gesture or action. So these are Reinhardt's words. No lines or imaginings, no shapes or composings or representings, no visions or sensations or impulses, no symbols or signs or impastos, no decoratings or colourings or picturings, no pleasures or pains, no accidents or ready-mades, no things, no ideas, no relations, no attributes, no qualities, nothing that is not of the essence. And the paintings I can only describe to you the exquisite beauty of these paintings. They are unlike anything else, and they're very rarely ever seen in this country. But if you go to the Gagosian Gallery in Britannia Street near King's Cross, you'll also find in the current exhibition a small red Ad Reinhardt about this big, which is earlier than the late paintings, but reveals, even its beautifully modest sort of painting, the fantastic delicacy of surface that he aspired to achieve with the brush. And it has to be understood, I think, that for Ad Reinhardt, the space of the studio, the practice of studio work, was absolutely intrinsic to the making and potential reception of the appearance of the paintings themselves. He was a completely diligent, consistent painter in the studio. Imagine 6 or 7 years of painting the same painting, in a sense, revealing not a cynical nihilism about the impossibility of innovation, but the very opposite, actually. The involvement in the making of the painting was the thing. He'd found the way to make the painting that he wanted to make, and the practice of that brings us back to this notion of the contemplative practice. It was a contemplative practice, and it brought about paintings that invite us, I think, to regard them in a contemplative mode. Now, as a brief aside, as we move towards 6 o'clock, I wanted to draw our attention. We'll end with this contemplative moment in a few minutes. But I just wanted to draw us back to this notion of the physicality, the materiality of the painting. Because the one thing we don't have in the midst of all 6 of these lectures in front of us ever is a painting. We only have images of paintings, and images of paintings are not paintings. The fresco we've talked about. We think about what we've said about fresco and its material qualities. This is a photograph of a work made by the artist Yannis Kounelis, a Greek artist resident in Rome for many years, who currently has a major exhibition at Modern Art in Oxford. This is a photograph, as far as I know, it's about the only remaining photograph from a work he made in 1969, in which 12 horses were tethered in an art space. Untitled, 12 Horses, 1969. And this work was represented 3 years ago at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, in which horses were taken into the downstairs space of the Whitechapel Art Gallery and tethered for one day. In a conversation, Kounelis remarked, when asked what the crucial thing was, what's the main decision, what are you thinking about with this? He said the main thing is how the horses are attached to the wall. He said the fixing has to be real, it has to be authentic, it has to be actual, it has to be strong. What really matters is how the horse is tethered to the wall. And, you know, we can see from the prosaic nature of this that Kounelis wasn't aspiring to a sort of George Stubbs compositional achievement here. You know, there's nothing in what Kounelis has said about this to imply that he's thinking, you know, we'll put the grey next to the chestnut and the bay over there. You know, there isn't that kind of composing going on. But in an aside almost, he remarked, and this is quite consistent with his entire life sort of statements, he said it's about fresco. And at first, I didn't get any further with that than to think that means it's architectural, it means it's the wall, and maybe it means that the image is related to the wall. But more than that, I think it's a very, really quite startling poetic shift. I think what he was really saying to me was, what matters is how the horse is attached to the wall. It's just like fresco. You know. The substance of the image, the substance of the work is sucked into the surface of the wall. And similarly for Kounelis, the horse is fixed to the wall. It's interesting if you read around Piero, Adrian Stokes, for instance, not read as often anymore as he probably should be. He talks about fresco rising to the forefront in the Renaissance with a return to what he calls wall significance, which I think is an interesting word, especially for architects. It's something completely different to that Gothic notion of the surface as something to be glazed, to have the maximum amount of glass penetrating it. It's the notion of wall significance, when the presence of the continuous surface of wall becomes important. And just to pursue this rather radical sort of poetic application of language, to do with painting to what seem like totally three-dimensional achievements. This shows the main room at Oxford at the moment. I'm sorry I badly montaged two halves of an image together in the middle. These big crosses of manufactured steel propped up march across a floor covered with kilim rugs from Turkey. This is a detail from the catalogue showing just how uncomfortable the presence of these heavy manufactured metal objects are on these surfaces. Cornelis talks about this work and describes the floor of rugs as a sensitive, cultured skin. And he describes the crosses marching across it as graffiti. And I thought, my goodness, what's that? Three-dimensional graffiti. And of course, what he means is, you know, not sgraffito. He could have said sgraffito, which would imply, you know, that technique if you're making pottery. If anybody of you have made pots, when you decorate the surface of a pot with scratches, it's sgraffito. Graffiti has this completely different association, and in this instance, no doubt about it, to damage. Drawing attention to this notion of a sensitive, cultured surface of fabric again. And here we see the skate of the Reverend Robert Walker cutting into the ice of Duddington Loch. This is a detail of the Reverend skate cutting into the ice of the loch. And the way Raeburn painted this, and by the way, this painting is also, it's about this big, tiny. 2 layers of paint, wet on dry. No doubt about it, the implement that was used was the tip of the wooden end of a small brush handle scratched through the paint, literally physical scars, and occasional highlights of another tone to draw attention to this. And it's often remarked upon now that the whole ensemble is even more sort of beautifully materialized through the cracking of the oil paint itself, which you can see very clearly in this photograph. So for all its elegance and composure and finesse, the painting is extremely physically achieved. And it draws our attention to this notion of surfaceness all over again. These, as you can see from the caption, are actual graffiti from the walls of Piero della Francesca's fresco at Arezzo. Bacci was one of the assistant painters of the big Arezzo frescoes. That's when he died. This also another date, simply a date. Not much has changed in the content of graffiti since the 15th century, it seems. And just to rush us towards a sort of architectural moment, this is the scratched inside surface of a horizontal plaster tracing floor. One at Wells, one at York. The 2 only remaining plaster floors of their type that were used by stonemasons to mark out with a stylus the full-scale curves of architectural details for the buildings that now have grown up around these floors. You can see the curves and arabesques typical of stone arch stonework. And to introduce a slight indulgence, a photograph of a work of my own. This is a still image from a temporary illumination that I first made in 1991 and remade 2 years ago at King's College in Cambridge, in which the surface of the building was illuminated with blue light between broad daylight, when you could see no blueness at all, and darkness, when the intensity of the light became apparent. And as you can see, this is not a facade that is from the era of wall significance. This is a facade from the era of the highest degree of transparency. But the reason it's here in the talk is that it created a space in the front court of King's College in Cambridge, which you can visit. This is the lawn. It created a space a horizontal space in relation to a vertical plane, into which visitors and viewers walked in the early evening, and in which viewers took up a relationship between themselves and this huge reflective vertical surface. It was, I think, if I could comment on my own work without seeming to sort of construct this too much, that it was, the photograph exaggerates the work enormously. It appears as a quite spectacular image to me, and the work didn't have that feeling about it. It was immensely quiet. And the tendency on the evenings that it was there, which the last time 2 years ago was only 2 evenings, was that people gathered and stood around and simply turned and noticed the work from time to time. It was a very sort of quiet occasion. And it brings me to my sort of concluding thoughts, really, which is that in the absence of paintings and only in the presence of images of them, especially looking at images of them quite bizarrely suspended in space like this, not even related to the wall surface like this slide, that perhaps the invitation in the contemplative painting is actually one that involves the physical relationship, not only the optical examination, but actually the physical relationship of the viewer to the painted surface. For a long time I felt a very subjective feeling. I can't tell you why this is. I can simply say that it is so for me. My experience of looking at this angle, and my experience whenever I have the luck to see one of the late Ad Reinhardt paintings, is of the same order. The emotional relationship that I feel drawn to between these two seemingly completely disparate paintings is incredibly similar. It's incredibly close. And I can only suggest that a part of that comparability, of that equivalence, is that when I'm in front of an Ad Reinhardt painting of the type I've been describing, that in a sense I'm taking up, literally and physically and actually in space, a relationship that relates to the kind of relationship that we see the figures in some of the figurative paintings that I've been showing you, the relationship they have to the depicted spaces, these shallow spaces that are frequently defined by a plane which is extremely close and parallel to the picture plane itself. It's worth noting, I think, that when we look at reproductions of paintings, as you have been this afternoon, and as you do, as we all do usually when we look at books or magazines, or look at images of paintings on the television set even, that our physical mode of connection with them is seated Usually when we look at reproductions of paintings, we're sitting down. And very often when we look at reproductions of paintings, we're holding the page, the book, the catalogue, the magazine. And the relationship that that page has to us is, well, it's probably slightly diagonal. If we're formal readers, we might lay a book out on a table and turn pages carefully. We may be lying back on the sofa, flicking things. When we look at paintings, in the spaces that we've provided for ourselves culturally to look at them on purpose in, we're invariably, not entirely, because sometimes there are seats, but we're invariably standing up. You know, if you go to the National Gallery to look at that Turner painting, you can sit on a very comfortable upholstered leather bench, but you're about as far as I am from where I'm standing to that window blind. If you do that, you know, you can take in the wall, but you can't really see the painting. To see the painting, you walk up to it and you stand vertically looking at this vertical plane. Somewhere in that relationship, I think, is an essential to the qualities of painting. I announced an ambition at the beginning of all of this, which I don't think I've remotely even approached talking about, which is the unique capacity of some painting to embody stillness. But I think the notion of as it were, a stilled painting, stilling the viewer, you know, holding us still, standing in a contemplative state, is a part of that, in addition to everything that could be said about the transience of human experience, in comparison to the continuity, at least for considerable periods of time, the stable continuity of the still painting surface. I think there is a participatory stillness in the viewer on occasion. It's something that is experienced, rather. You might say this about the notion of beauty, that it isn't necessarily to be found in the qualities to be described in an object. It's to be found in the nature of an experience within the viewer. I think I'll draw everything to a close there, but I'd be delighted if anybody had any questions. Thank you very much. Any questions, anybody? Yes. Yes. That's very true. Yes, that's true. You haven't heard me talk about that work in more depth, have you, ever? Because it is just anecdotally in response to that. It's absolutely true. If you go as a visitor to King's College, you almost don't even have to do more than look at the grass for a porter to come out of the porter's lodge and tell you to keep off it. And if you dare to step, as tourists often do, step backwards with their cameras to improve, a group of friends with the chapel in the background, then you get very severely told off. It's embarrassing, really. But senior members of the college have permission to walk across it, which makes it an even more acute sort of territorial announcement, especially when it's pouring with rain and you see Cambridge folk with their Sainsbury's bags or something coming back from the market square, having to go all the way around this great big rectangle to walk through the colleges to where a lot of people park their cars. And I made that work because I had the good fortune to spend a year there as an artist in residence in 1991. And I was endowed with the same privilege that I could walk across the grass. That privilege ended promptly on the last day of the residency. And the porters who by that time were perfectly nice and very friendly and so on, gave me no quarter, a week later when I just thought I'd take a shortcut. But the work was, two permissions were given by the college which were unusual for it. One was that the front court of the college was open after dark, which it never usually is to non-college members. And the second was they allowed visitors who came to see the work to stand on the grass. So there was a little territorial victory in which I didn't realize was going to happen that brought that about. And so it's a good point you raise because it clarifies the fact that the viewer had a quite free spatial relationship to this big blue surface. That's what we managed to bring about for a couple of days anyway. I think I saw another hand somewhere else.
There's those fascinating photographs taken by Hans Naumann of people studying paintings with their back to the camera, rather in a way like Richard's daughter. But although the effect is completely different, because the kind of result is not turned around.
Yes.
But those figures in the photographs are just like in Castel Friedrich, where you paint figures with their back to the picture place.
Yes.
Looking out over the mountains over the sea. And
I can give you one of those, Brian, if you like. Would you like one?
oh yeah. I don't know why he did them, how the occasions on which he did them, the seven of them, and they look almost as if they're looking out through a pane of sheer glass through the night. And the white zips are really just cold, like Philosophy and the Mies van der Rohe
Yes.
glass wall.
Yes.
And I had a student last year wrote an essay about Newman and Donald Judd. And the pictures of Don Judd seen through his boxes. Now, the thing is, we realise that there's a kind of apron of space. That if you take the vertical dimension and you lay it down like that, there is an apron of space which is activated horizontally in front of the painting. And it occurred to me that your piece at Cambridge seemed to sort of, in some way, play with the same possibility.
Yes. I've always thought, really, since I started thinking about my responses to paintings, I've always thought that different paintings, physically, they move us spatially in relation to themselves. And different paintings move us to different sorts of proximities. You know, there are some paintings that literally make you go up to them like this, and that's really where you have to be to see them at all. And there are other paintings that, you know, you go up to them like that and they kind of It's almost as if the painting is pushing you away from them. I think there are very important perceptual mechanisms at work between the eye and this notion of physical proximity and the nature of this surface, and not only the nature of the space that might be represented in the painting, but by its physicality. Because in the end, we are looking at objects. We're looking at the paint of paintings, not only, the apparent presence of a woman sitting in a space. We're looking at the paint of paintings. And I think what you say is absolutely true, this notion of proximity. I'd thought about bringing Barnett Newman more into this, but I haven't. I made a decision that I would only talk about things that had a completely compelling sort of effect on me, that I felt really genuinely close to. And I've rarely felt the same degree of closeness to Newman's paintings, that I think I'd need to talk about them, from the heart, or properly in a committed sort of way. I could do it in a different sort of context where I was thinking more about something maybe a little bit more art historical. But if you want to read something very, very unusual and interesting about Barnett Newman, I recommend the chapter on Barnett Newman in Peter de Bola's book called Art Matters, in which, I don't know whether Pete has brought this about, but he was intending to do that chapter as a lecture with a very large-scale projection of a Barnett Newman and him standing in front of it to deliver the talk, which I think must be related to what you're... Peter de Bola, D-E, and then second part of the name Bola, B-O-L-L-A. Small d-E and then capital B-O-L-L-A. Peter de Bola, Art Matters. It's a fascinating book. It includes a chapter on Glenn Gould playing the Goldberg Variations, a chapter on Wordsworth, and a chapter on Barnett Newman, which is extraordinary content when you think about it. But it's on the recommended list. Philip.
Yeah. Mike's career mostly at lost in the National Gallery for Vermeer painting. And of course, that chair in the foreground. Obviously, when you're sitting listening to it, you want to play music, or you've been listening to it, and you walk away from it. And something occurred to me, the personality of the coat and
Oh, yes.
that same sense of what goes on, or taking it for first review of taking it off, or bigger.
Yes. That's a very interesting thought. Mercurial. Yes. That's a nice thought. Philip's observation that perhaps the chair in the foreground of the Vermeer suggests an invitation to, as it were, sit, to enter the space of the painting, or the suggestion that a departure has been made from it, out of the space. That's rather beautiful. But also, Philip mentioned that in the Janus Canellis work, you couldn't see from the view I had, but there is a big black overcoat and Homburg hat hanging on the end of the structure, which is a signature sort of presence in a number of Canellis's work, this hat and coat. And there definitely is the suggestion that somebody may have just arrived or have just left the scene. A couple of people, Adrian Searle remarked that he thought perhaps it was Franz Kafka who'd just gone off for a cup of coffee or something. But of course a lot of people regard it as Canellis's presence himself, He speaks about it sometimes as an old-fashioned bourgeois kind of piece of iconography, you know, the hat and the coat.
When I see in New York, the coat is actually crushed
Mm.
into your face.
Mm. Well, that thing about this quite sort of daring insistence that Canellis has making things like that, and then sitting down in an interview and saying, "I'm a painter," you know, is amplified a little bit. A question asked of him by Rudy Fuchs in Oxford in a conversation was, a man said, "I know I was encouraged even by the gallery staff to walk on the carpets, but I didn't want to walk on them because it seemed disrespectful and I didn't want to harm them." And Canellis said he felt it wasn't necessary to, you know, there's a lot of viewers I think, "Ooh, it's a participatory spatial experience, I've got to clamber about in there." But the more I look at his work, the more I realize that he's an image maker, really. He composes extraordinarily memorable images. And I think the primary insistence that he has about being a painter lies in that. And he's not so concerned that you walk all the way around an object. He's more concerned that you view the ensemble as a piece of iconography. And in that way, I think he sort of would swerve, if we pursued the Canellis connection, we'd swerve the conversation into a different category of painting eventually, you know, that would go more towards the kind of Caravaggio spatiality, which, you know, that deep, dramatic space, I realize is absent from just about everything I've introduced into the series. It's a very different sort of space, but you can see why so many sculptors admire Caravaggio's paintings. Any other thoughts? Okay. Well, thanks for your patience, and I'll see several of you tomorrow morning at Westminster University, which I look forward to. You've probably had enough of me altogether now by the end of this. I'm going to have a glass of beer in the bar, and if anybody wants to hang around and talk a bit more, I'll be happy to do that upstairs. Thanks.